It's the burning political question on everyone's mind this year. Will Donald Trump face criminal trial before the November election? Well, we could get an answer as early as next week. Monday was supposed to be day one of Trump's New York hush money trial, but it was pushed back to mid-April after prosecutors handed over a last-minute batch of documents. Instead, on Monday, Judge Marchand will hold a hearing to assess that evidence, and he is expected to set a trial date. But even though it may seem like Trump's delay tactics are working, there is one thing that he can't delay anymore, and that is the $454 million he owes New York Attorney General Letitia James. And the clock is ticking, as Trump has less than 72 hours to put up the money. Or the AG can begin seizing his bank accounts or properties in any state, including potentially Trump Tower or Mar-a-Lago. And despite the fact that Trump's lawyers say he's been unable to secure a bond, Trump, in one of his unhinged overnight all-cap social media rants, claimed that, quote, through hard work, talent, and luck, he actually has almost $500 million in cash, which is basically just undercutting his own lawyer's arguments. Joining me now to discuss is Charles Coleman, civil rights attorney, former Brooklyn prosecutor, and MSNBC legal analyst, and one of the best-dressed people on the air. Great to see you, Charles. And David K. Johnston, founder of DCReport.org and author of The Big Cheat, one of the best experts on Trump ever. David K., I'm going to start with you. This, from a legal and a political standpoint, we've all been terrified about the fact that Donald Trump is going to use all the delaying tactics that he can to not have to pay his fines, to not be held accountable. But I want you to contextualize this, which you do an excellent job of. Isn't this just exactly how Trump does everything? Hasn't he always had a life of running up bills and fines and then getting out of it? That's what I'm seeing here. Is that what you see?
Yeah. For the whole 35 years I've covered Donald, it's been the same story. He's not a wealth builder. He is a money extractor, and it runs through his hands like water. And that's why he's constantly needed more cash. Now, on Monday, it's possible he will pull a financial rabbit out of the hat yet again. We may not know how he got the $500 million. We may not know to whom he is beholden, but don't be surprised if somehow at the last moment he comes up with the money to delay any enforcement action by depositing it with the court.
Charles, I've asked this question, before, and I've asked several different experts. Is there a sort of order or a strategy to what assets Tish James may take from Trump if he's not able to come up with the money? Like I said, I have my dream that Trump Tower will be covered with a giant banner that says Spirit of Halloween. That probably won't happen. They're not going to take the Trump Tower. They're not going to take the letters on day one, right? But what do they go after first? And is there a strategy to that? Or is it just what's the easiest thing to acquire from her office?
Well, I think those two things are one and the same in the sense that you go after what's easiest not only to acquire, but also to liquidate. When you're talking about real property assets, Jason, one of the difficulties that you think about if you are Letitia James and her office is, number one, the notion of valuing those things is very difficult because you have to get them appraised. And then once you get them appraised, you have to go into the long and protracted process of actually liquidating those things. Not to mention that in between that process, you actually have to manage those things. So Mar-a-Lago, for example, is a resort. In the middle of seizing Mar-a-Lago, you would then have to take over and assume responsibility for the management of Mar-a-Lago so that the property value did not go down significantly. That's not the business that Letitia James and the Office of the Attorney General are in the state of New York. So that's not going to be attractive. So all of these things are going to be considerations when you talk about what the value is, but then also what is the ease in which we can turn this property, if you will, or this asset into hard cash, because that's what is king in this situation.
Yeah, the idea that we're basically trying to, that the government's office is going to have to try and flip Donald Trump sounds like an HGTV show, but it's actually the tactical legal process we have to go through. Charles, I want to follow up on this because I think this is really interesting. What would be a potential danger? Let's say the New York office did go after Mar-a-Lago. Wouldn't there be a potential risk that the money it takes to manage that asset ends up eating away at the eventual value of selling it? Is that one of the dangers?
That's absolutely the case. I can tell you as a former prosecutor that you do not necessarily want to seize things that are not real property in terms of, cars, boats, homes, and things of that nature. You don't want to seize businesses. You want hard cash or things that you can very easily auction off, liquidate, and get the cash for right away. Something like Mar-a-Lago is a very risky item or property to seize because, again, that value is going to fluctuate in such a way that the Attorney General's office could potentially lose money, or the value that they seize it for may not ultimately be the value that they get once they liquidate it. And then at that point, the judge is going to look at them and say, well, that's your fault, not necessarily the fault of the defendant in this case. And so you have to be very careful with the types of assets that you go after, whether they're real property or otherwise, because you can't control what happens once you take control of them, especially if they're active businesses, the likes of which you're not responsible or accustomed to actually running, so you're not used to that.
David, there is another potential windfall other than, say, Russia and foreign money, which is where Trump seems to usually get his money from. But there is another potential windfall he has. There is the sort of going public of this Truth Social, and Trump could get access to up to $3 billion. But there's a catch to this. What Politico is saying right now is that even though Trump's stake will be tied up for much of the year under a so-called lockup agreement, a normal arrangement for such deals to ensure that insiders don't bail as soon as a company goes public and push down the stock price. Trump could try to obtain a waiver from that rule, but even then he wouldn't be able to sell more than a small fraction of his stake at any given time, up to 1% of the outstanding shares every quarter. David, again, Trump has made a career of trying to skirt around these kinds of rules. Do you think he's going to just try and cash out a Truth Social and then fight in court to see if he can use all the money now rather than trying to use it later? Because that seems to be the only way, other than going to a foreign government, that he could get the kind of cash he needs.
Well, actually, Wall Street came up with more than 30 years ago other techniques to do this sort of thing. During the dot-com era, we had all these executives who got founders who got $100,000 salaries, but they suddenly owned yachts and airplanes. And, where did they get the money? They didn't sell any stock. What you do is you pledge the stock to one of the investment houses or wealthy people, in Donald's case, perhaps, and they advance you cash against it. Now, of course, the risk they run is that 6 months from now, the stock will be worthless, but they can also do what's called a naked short of that stock, and they have his stock as a short, which would insulate them. I'm reminded here of the line in Trading Places where Eddie Murphy says, "Oh, I get it. You guys are bookies." And Donald can probably find a way to get someone to finance it. But if anybody is financing Donald, if he doesn't have, this crazy claim today, he's got $500 million, we need to really be worried about who's behind this. And I don't mean the person who wrote the check. I mean who's behind them, because we've never had a president in hock to other people. Right now, he's in hock to a Swiss insurance company for $83 million. This is a national security nightmare. The framers of our Constitution, who were very careful to protect the president from income by the state governments or foreign interests, they never thought about debt.